What's up, everybody? I'm back with another VHS DVD review, and today I'm going to be starting off this lot of snowy and winter and Christmas releases off with a very interesting release, Santa Toopy. So let's cut the chatter and get on to this for the release history of the first ever DVD from the series. Santa Toopy was first released onto DVD on November 7th, 2005 by Treehouse, Kaboom, and Phase 4 Films. This DVD was the first one to be released for the franchise, and it's a pretty good one. In between 2005 and 2014, you can find this DVD with either the Phase 4 Films logo or the Peace Arch Entertainment logo. I don't know how rare both are, but I'm gonna say they're incredibly common to come by. But back on topic, in 2014, a 3 DVD holiday gift set named A Very Toopy and Binu Christmas was released by Kaboom. And it came with not just Santa Toopy, but Big Parade and Snowflakes. So that pretty much wraps up the history of this release. Now let's go on to our episodes. So Santa Toopy contains 12 episodes on the release. Santa Toopy, The 7 Binus, 4 Seasons, Topsy-turvy, Little Bo Toopy, Cinder Binu, Binu's Island, Puppet Show, Cuckoo Clock, Play Clay, Bistro Binu, and Robot Doctors. So let's begin with our first episode, Santa Toopy. It's Christmas in July, and Toopy and Binu are delivering presents to their friends, which turns out to be slippers. After the deliveries, they get a present of their own from Saint Nick flying by. What can I say about this episode that hasn't been said? It's f***ing awesome. I think that A Christmas in July episode is pretty excellent, and I actually do like it. I do have to question why the holidays after Christmas at the end of this episode are so close together. That is one thing that bugs me, but I'm not entirely bothered by that. So overall, I think Santa Toopy is a pretty awesome way to start off the DVD, as well as the releases, and it's one of my top favorites. 10 out of 10. Now we have our second episode, The 7 Binus. Toopy creates 6 snow Binus, and when he shows Binu, they come to life, and they have fun throughout the winter day. This episode is amazing. It's glorious, and I think it's remarkable. The main reason why this episode is so popular is the song, but which I will admit, it makes me tear up every now and then. I don't know what it is with the song, but it just does. However, throughout this episode, there are scenes from the various episodes that I will be taking a look at in the future, aside from from numbers 3 and 5. But I do have to question, why did the other 6 Binus disappear after this episode? I think it would have been very excellent to see 7 Binus in the series moving forward. But although I'm bugged by that, this episode is an amazing one, and one that I could watch over and over again. 8 out of 10. On to the third episode, 4 Seasons. Toopy wants nothing more than to sled down the hill with Binu, and they invite the snowman with them. They then sled through the 4 seasons, from winter to the other 3 and back again. This episode is remarkably awesome. Although ridiculous as all king hell for a story, but it's a fun one. I do like how they were able to incorporate the 4 seasons into one episode. That is something that shouldn't go unnoticed. But I have to wonder, if the hill was that short, how are they able to get through an entire episode with the 4 seasons? Although that is something I have to bring up, it's nice. Overall, I'd say that 4 seasons is a pretty amazing episode that is enjoyable throughout the whole year. 9 out of 10. Now we have our 4th episode, Topsy-turvy. It's a hot summer day, and Toopy and Binu use their popsicles they've been having as ice skates to ski on towards a ice cream-filled oasis. What can I say about this episode other than it's fucking beautiful? I love the visuals for this episode. Seeing a sweet treat inspired oasis is amazing. But if there's one thing I have to complain about, it's Binu's constant. It's how they started off warm, cool down, but started to get cold throughout the entire episode. Although that is a small gripe, it's still something I have to bring up. But other than that, I think this episode is a pretty remarkable one throughout the whole year, throughout the summer season. So while it is a pretty amazing favorite, it's one of my favorites on the release. 8 out of 10. Now we move on to our 5th episode, Little Bo Toopy. Toopy and Binu lose the last piece of the jigsaw puzzle and have to go find it. But they have no luck in Puzzle Land until they realize that the piece is on Toopy's butt. This one is pretty hilarious. But if I have to point something out, does this episode take place after the Land of the Lost? Because they found the last piece of the jigsaw puzzle there. But although that is something I'll be taking a look at later, that is something I should point out. What I should also point out is how Toopy and Binu didn't notice how the piece was on Toopy's ass the whole time. Of course, this is also but overall, this episode is a bit funny and enjoyable, and one that I can sit through for the whole and enjoy. 7 out of 10. Now we're halfway through and into our 6th episode, Cinder Binu. Toopy and Binu are heading to a fancy party, but it's late at night and Binu can't seem to get sleep because of it. They take a long time looking through the proper footwear for Binu and then end up running and are too late in the end. I do have to point out, this episode probably takes place after Godmother Toopy, presumably. And while this episode is a good pickup, it is questionable. I do have to point out that even though it is late at night, how did Toopy not notice Binu's sleep deprivation? That's messed up. But overall, I think this episode is a bit entertaining despite that small gripe. And I have to admit, this is one of the many times where I prefer a somewhat bland episode with a somewhat bland formula. I don't know whether to rate this in a 7 or an 8, so I'm going to split it in the middle and rate it a 7.5 out of 10. Now we have our 7th episode, Binu's Island. invites Binu out into the snow, but Binu can't hear him over the blaring radio. So Toopy sets off out into Binu's island to tell him what he was trying to say. While this is a somewhat good story, I'm not the biggest fan of this one. And this is probably one of the weakest ones on the release. And no, it's not because it's a terrible Binu episode, but the reason why is, how did Binu not notice his radio was too loud? Is, to quote the last video, "Are your f***ing ears broken?" And wouldn't he have gone deaf before Toopy got to the island? And how did Binu get from that said island to where Toopy was if Binu didn't have a boat? That continuity is a big problem for this episode. And although it is a fine one, I don't really consider this one I would go crazy about. So overall, I'd say that Binu's Island is a weak episode and one that I would be more than happy to skip over half of the time. I rate this dumpster fire of an episode a 6 out of 10. Other than that, I couldn't care less about this episode. So, yeah, moving on. Now we have our 8th episode, Puppet Show. Binu wants to put on a puppet show for Toopy, but Toopy says that there are so many things that there are missing. But it turns out that the only thing that was missing was a puppet of Binu. This episode is interesting, to say the most, for positive and negative reasons. I did like this episode, and I still do, but my opinions on this are a bit mixed. On one hand, it's a good episode, but on the other hand, yikes, what a load of stuff Toopy had to put in there. I'm as confused as how he didn't notice one of Binu's hands behind him the whole time, and how Binu never said anything to him. But unfortunately, apart from that, this episode is pretty good. Even though it's not perfect, it's far from being a bad episode. I don't know whether to rate this one an 8 or a 9. So, I'm going to split in the middle and give it a somewhat solid 8.5 out of 10. And now we move on to our 9th episode, Cuckoo Clock. Toopy and Binu follow a bird in the clock and encounter a few different rooms in it. They soon chase it, only to realize that it was uncatchable. This episode is amazing. Ridiculous as all hell, but it's f***ing awesome. And it's obviously one of the best on the release. I like how the quick pace of this episode and how they were able to fit so much into a short story format. But the only question I have is, how did the bird know when to pop up? That's just something that I have to point out. But overall, I'd say that this quick-paced episode is fun and enjoyable, and one I could keep watching over and over again. 10 out of 10. And now we move on to our 10th episode, Play Clay. It's raining, and Toopy and Binu make a lot of clay creations and end up chasing each other with them, until push comes to shove when Binu makes the most terrifying creature of all. This episode is mostly remembered for Toopy, for the monster out of clay that Binu made. Although that monster is cool, that doesn't make me like the episode. It's kind of mediocre at most for me. And I don't really know where they got the extra clay from. That's one thing that doesn't make sense, because those are small containers. I don't really get that. But overall, I think the monsters are pretty excellent, and using clay, that's saying something. But even though this episode may be fun, a bit kooky, and a little bit enjoyable, I think this episode is a bit overrated because of the monster. And I want to be fair though, so the best I can rate this episode is a 6 out of 10. Now we move on to the 11th episode, Bistro Binu. Binu is at a restaurant at night and demands a big load of food. However, he then bites off more than he can literally chew when he floats out of the restaurant. While this episode may be likable to some, I think this is the weakest on the release. First off, Binu can't bite off more than he can chew. And the big amount of food that he ate, holy crap, that is a lot. But even for someone his size, it's the equivalent of me at a buffet. That's quite a lot, even for me. So even though, and I'd say that this one has a messy plot, and although the restaurant plot is a good one for the series, I think it gets totally lost based on Binu's severe eating habits. And that's kind of insulting. I don't know whether to rate this episode a 4 based on how terrible it is, or a 5 based on how mediocre it is, or a 6 based on how kooky it is. So I'm going to split it and give it a 5.5 out of 10. And now we have the final episode, Robot Doctors. Binu gets a bruise on his hand, and Toopy sorts it out. Meanwhile, a robot has troubles of its own, and it's up to Toopy and Binu to resolve the problem. I'd say, while this episode it may not be the best way to close off the release, I think it's average enough. Even though it may seem a bit shady in a few ways, I think it's not that bad. How they were able to show that in 4 minutes and 30 seconds is somewhat incredible and shouldn't go unnoticed. So, and I'm not entirely bothered by a simplistic formula put into a 4-minute, 30-second episode. I'm not saying this episode is a fantastic one, but I'd say it's doable enough based on how they were managed to execute this, and it's one of the big favorites to me. So as a solid way to close off the DVD, it's solid enough. I rank it an 8 out of 10. So what do I think of Santa Toopy? For the first ever DVD for the series, I think it really prevails. There may be some episodes that don't fit the winter and Christmas theme, but that's what makes it unique in a sense. It's the Thomas's Christmas Party and the Thomas's Halloween Adventures of the Toopy and Binu DVDs. There may be some episodes on here that I may not like, but it's a solid selection, and for the first ones featured, I think they're pretty amazing. While some people may have different opinions on the episodes on here, it's what makes it unique. So overall, While it may be a good one to watch at Christmas, but I think it's even better to watch during the rest of the year, depending on how you look at it. So, as the first DVD from the series, I'd highly recommend getting this if you're a fan of the series and a die-hard Toopy and Binu fan. And that wraps up this review. I'd like to say thank you to all you viewers for watching, and feel free to check out my playlist with my other review of Team Up for Adventure, which is in the description. So what am I going to do in time for the next review? Well, it's time to continue on with the Christmas and winter reviews, and I think it's time we visit some of our friends who are having a holly jolly, joyful holiday. See you guys next time.